It all started when my younger brother, during his school days, used to attend a tutoring center. One day, the teacher there shared a strange, eerie story from his college days. The teacher had attended a university that was not his first choice, and he had to live in a rough part of the city to save money. The neighborhood was filled with narrow alleys, and streetlights were sparse. He often thought the area was dangerous, especially for women. But since he was a man, he always walked through a specific alley that served as a shortcut to his apartment. One rainy night, after drinking more than usual with his classmates, he was stumbling his way back home. It was one of those rare times when he had blackouts from drinking. As he walked through the narrow alley, he noticed a man in a raincoat walking toward him from the opposite end. The man's face was obscured by the hood. The alley was so narrow that if two people crossed paths, their shoulders would inevitably brush. As they passed each other, the man's shoulder bag hit the teacher hard, causing him to lose balance and fall against the rough wall. His hand scraped against the brick, stinging sharply. Frustrated, the teacher turned around and shouted, "Hey, watch it," expecting an apology. The man in the raincoat stopped and slowly turned his head. For a brief moment, their eyes met, cold and unsettling. Without saying a word, the man turned back and walked away into the rain. Annoyed and wet from the rain, the teacher eventually made it home, stripped off his soaked clothes, and collapsed on the living room floor, exhausted. As he lay there, something strange crossed his mind. When they had collided, he had caught a strong whiff of a scent, not the typical smell of rain or even men's cologne. It was the unmistakable scent of women's heavy cosmetics, almost overpowering. That's weird, he thought. Why would a man smell like women's makeup? He shook off the thought and fell asleep. The next morning, as he showered, something caught his attention. On the wall near the bathroom mirror, faint but visible, was a red smear. His heart raced as he leaned closer. It wasn't paint. It was lipstick drawn in a jagged line. A chill ran down his spine as he recalled the raincoat figure and that unsettling scent. How had that mark gotten there? He lived alone. To this day, the teacher swears that whatever happened that night wasn't just a drunken hallucination, but something far more sinister. The teacher was wearing a white shirt that day. When he looked closely in the mirror the next morning, he noticed faint traces of makeup on it. There was a subtle foundation-like stain, the kind women use to even out their skin tone, along with a faint smudge of what looked like lipstick. He was puzzled. Where did this come from, he thought. Sure, he'd been drinking with classmates, including some female friends. Maybe one of them brushed past him by accident, but the only person he distinctly remembered bumping into was that man in the raincoat. That didn't make sense. Shrugging it off, he went on with his day. Time passed, and the incident faded from his mind until something else strange happened. The teacher often studied late into the night. To take breaks, he'd go up to the rooftop to smoke. From there, he had a clear view of the neighboring buildings. One building, in particular, caught his attention. Most apartments had white fluorescent lights, but one unit always had an eerie orange glow, even in the early hours of the morning. Curious, he would watch from afar. Sometimes, he saw a shadow moving frantically back and forth inside the room. Must be someone else burning the midnight oil, he thought, puffing on his cigarette. Wonder what they're up to at this hour. One day, a classmate asked him to come along to pick up some papers he'd forgotten at home. Coincidentally, the friend lived in that very building, just a few floors below the strange orange-lit apartment. As they walked up the stairs, the teacher asked, "Hey, do you ever hear strange noises late at night? Like footsteps or something?" His friend frowned. "Actually, yeah. The guy living in that apartment is weird. The landlord's always arguing with him about his water and electricity usage. They say he never cleans his place and stays up all night. The teacher nodded thoughtfully. Figures. I've seen shadows moving around there at night. A few weeks went by, and life got busy with school and assignments. One morning, on his way to campus, the teacher was surprised to see police tape cordoning off the alley near the building. A crowd had gathered, neighbors murmuring anxiously. Curiosity piqued. He approached the scene. "What's going on?" he asked someone nearby. An elderly woman muttered, "I knew something was off about that apartment. I told the landlord, but no one listened." The teacher spotted his classmate standing near the crowd, his face pale and shaken. Rushing over, he asked, "Hey, what happened?" His friend didn't respond, eyes wide with shock. Grabbing his friend's shoulder, the teacher shook him gently. "What is it? What's going on?" His friend finally whispered, "They found a body in that apartment. The guy living there, he's gone." But that's not the weird part. The teacher's heart raced. "What do you mean?" They said. His friend's voice faltered. The body wasn't fresh. It had been there for weeks. "But I swear we saw shadows moving in that apartment just last night." The teacher's friend whispered. It wasn't just one victim. There were multiple women. As those words sank in, a cold chill ran down his spine. "You mean that apartment? The one with the orange light?" His friend nodded grimly. A flood of disturbing thoughts filled his mind. The strange shadows he'd seen pacing back and forth. The faint noises at night. Had he unknowingly witnessed a crime scene being cleaned up? And the man he'd bumped into in the alley that night. Could it have been him? The realization hit hard. The police tape meant the killer was still at large. Later, news broke that they had finally captured the suspect. To his horror, it was none other than the infamous serial killer who had terrorized the nation for months. The teacher couldn't believe it. He had come face to face with a man who would go down as one of the most notorious criminals in history. The second story is one I personally experienced, and I'll never forget it. I call it Why You Should Never Walk Through Dark Alleys. I was in high school back then. I was really into sports, kickboxing, judo, you name it. I even considered pursuing a career in it. Like most students, I had to attend mandatory evening study sessions until 10 p.m., but I convinced my teacher to let me leave early because I had training from 10 p.m. to midnight at a gym I'd been going to since I was a kid. The problem was, leaving school early drew unwanted attention. People in our small town noticed everything. I could feel their judgmental stares as I walked home in my uniform. To avoid being seen, I started taking a shortcut through a series of narrow, dimly lit alleys between storefronts. One night, as I was making my way home, a gray van crept up beside me. The window rolled down, and a man inside asked, "Hey, kid, can you tell me where the nearest bank is?" "It's just up ahead," I said, pointing down the street. Suddenly, the passenger door swung open and a thin, wiry man lunged at me, grabbing my arm. Instinct kicked in. I twisted his wrist and shoved him hard, sending him crashing against the van. But before I could catch my breath, the back doors of the van flew open and two massive guys, built like linebackers, jumped out. Panic set in. I knew I couldn't take them both, no matter how much I trained. Without a second thought, I turned and sprinted down the alley. Behind me, I heard them shouting in thick accents, their footsteps pounding the pavement. Luckily, I'd always been fast. I'd aced every physical fitness test at school except for the sprinting category, but that night, adrenaline made up for it. I dodged through side alleys, vaulted over a trash bin, and finally lost them near a busy intersection. Breathless and shaken, I made it home, locking the door behind me. To this day, I don't know who those men were or what they wanted,
But I do know one thing. Danger is always closer than you think. I was gasping for air, heart racing, crouched beneath the cold, metal stairs of the apartment building. I had blocked the entry with a couple of bikes, hoping it would keep me hidden. Minutes stretched into eternity. I kept thinking, they'll leave soon. They have to. 15 minutes passed. Then, I saw a shadow loom near the entrance. One of the massive guys from the van stepped inside, his heavy boots echoing against the concrete. I pressed my hand over my mouth, praying he wouldn't hear the thundering of my heart. He methodically searched every corner, his gaze sharp and predatory. I kept telling myself, he won't find me. This is safe. I'm hidden. But then I remembered something. My phone. What if someone called? I quickly turned it off, the faint click sounding like a gunshot in the tense silence. Eventually, the man grumbled something and left. I should have run right then, but fear had frozen me. I stayed there for over an hour, paralyzed by the thought that they might still be waiting outside. Finally, I crept out, moving as quietly as possible. But as I reached the street, my heart sank. There they were. The same two hulking figures stood near the intersection, talking to a wiry man who looked like their ringleader. They spotted me instantly. I bolted. My legs burned, but I pushed harder, zigzagging through alleys. I knew I couldn't keep this up much longer. Desperation drove me to a familiar place. A small church I occasionally visited, not for prayer, but for its second-floor ping-pong tables. I raced up the stairs and hid between the folded ping-pong tables, trying to control my breathing. Moments later, the lights flickered on. I heard their footsteps. They had followed me inside. They split up, their voices low but tense, speaking in a dialect I didn't fully recognize. The wiry guy, however, spoke perfect city slang. I held my breath, my thoughts racing. Why are these people here? What do they want from me? Just as panic was about to consume me, salvation arrived literally. The pastor walked in. "Excuse me," he said sternly. "This is private property. If you're here for ping pong or anything else, you need to register downstairs." The men exchanged glances, their eyes flickering with something dangerous. Then, from above, the choir began singing Christmas hymns. The sudden, ethereal music filled the space, breaking the tension. The pastor, sensing something was off, kept his ground. "Gentlemen, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." After a long, tense pause, the men muttered something under their breath and left. I stayed hidden until I was sure they were gone. That night, I realized how close I had come to something terrible. The world is darker than we think, and danger often hides in plain sight. I never thought a simple evening walk home would turn into a nightmare. The street was quiet, lit only by flickering streetlights, when I first noticed a black SUV creeping along behind me. My instincts kicked in, and I picked up my pace. Suddenly, the van sped up, tires screeching as it cut me off. 3 men, 2 burly ones and a wiry guy with a slick grin, jumped out. "Hey, hold up," the wiry guy called out, his voice casual but threatening. I didn't wait to find out what they wanted. I ran. My legs moved on pure adrenaline as I darted through alleyways and back streets. I could hear their heavy footsteps pounding behind me. I knew the area well. Years of neighborhood games as a kid had taught me every shortcut. I sprinted toward an apartment complex, slipping through a narrow gap in the fence. The men weren't as agile. I heard their curses as they struggled to follow. I ducked into a stairwell and spotted a space under the stairs cluttered with old bikes. I shoved the bikes aside and squeezed into the cramped space, pulling them back to cover me. My breathing was ragged, my heart racing like a drumbeat in my ears. Minutes passed. Then footsteps echoed in the stairwell. One of the burly men was back. He scanned the area, his eyes cold and calculating. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't notice the faint outline of my hiding spot. After what felt like an eternity, he left. I should have run then, but fear had me rooted to the spot. Eventually, I crept out, thinking the coast was clear. But as soon as I hit the street, my stomach dropped. The SUV was parked just ahead, the men leaning against it, scanning the area. They saw me. I took off again, my lungs burning. I knew I couldn't outrun them forever. Desperate, I headed for the local church, a place I rarely visited but knew had an upstairs rec room. I dashed inside and up the stairs, hiding between the folded ping-pong tables. My body trembled as I tried to steady my breathing. The door creaked open. The men were inside. They spread out, searching the room. I heard one mutter, "Where'd he go?" Just when I thought they might find me, the church lights flickered on and the pastor walked in. "Excuse me," he said firmly. "This is private property. If you're here for a game, you need permission." The men exchanged glances, their expressions hardening. Then, from the sanctuary, a choir began singing Christmas hymns. The sudden music seemed to break the tension. The pastor, sensing something was off, kept his ground. "I'll have to call the police if you don't leave." The men hesitated, but eventually backed off, muttering curses as they left. The pastor walked over to where I was hiding. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. I stepped out, shaking. "They were chasing me," I managed to say. The pastor nodded gravely. "Stay here until the choir finishes. I'll drive you home afterward. They won't follow if you blend in with the crowd." I was overwhelmed with gratitude. That night, the pastor saved me. And though I never told my family what happened, I started attending that church regularly. The world is full of dangers, sometimes closer than we think. But that night reminded me that there are still good people willing to step in and help when it matters most.